The knock came at 6 in the evening, just as Elias Van was pulling a pot of water off the stove. It was the kind of knock that didn't apologize for itself. 3 solid hits. Not urgent, not polite, just certain. The way someone knocks when they have already decided they will not leave until the door opens. Elias set the pot down slowly. He was 58 years old, and in all the years he had lived on that 12-acre parcel outside Harlow Ridge, West Virginia, he had learned to read the personality of a knock before he answered it. Neighbors knocked soft and fast, embarrassed to bother him. The mail carrier didn't knock at all, just left things on the step. The boy from the hardware store knocked twice and waited with his hands in his pockets. This knock was none of those. He dried his hands on a dishcloth, walked through the narrow hallway, and opened the front door. A young woman stood on his porch. She looked to be in her late 20s. Brown coat, worn at the elbows. Dark hair pulled back without much thought. She was not particularly tall. She did not look frightened. She looked like someone who had been frightened for a long time and had simply run out of it. In her arms, she held a blanket. Elias did not move. The blanket was yellow. Or it had been yellow once. Now it was the color of old paper left near a window, faded at the edges, soft in the way that only comes from years of being held and washed and held again. In the bottom right corner, embroidered in white thread, was a small rabbit. One ear was slightly longer than the other. He had made that blanket. He had made it on the porch of this very house, in the summer of 1996, sitting in the wooden chair that was still there, cracked now and never replaced. He had taught himself to embroider from a library book because his wife, Dina, had laughed and said you'll figure it out before she arrives, and he had wanted, more than almost anything, to prove her right. He had made 2 attempts at the rabbit. The first one looked more like a sock. The second one was better, but the left ear came out longer than intended, and Dina had said that's the one. She had pressed her hand flat against the finished square and said that's the one. Eli, don't redo it. He had not redone it. He had wrapped his daughter in it 4 days after she was born, in October of 1996, in the bedroom at the back of this house, and that was the last time he had seen either one of them. Now it was here, on his porch, in the arms of a stranger. He said nothing. His hand held the doorframe the way a man holds something when he is not sure whether he needs to hold himself up or hold himself back. The woman looked at him, not with pity, not with urgency, with something quieter and more frightening than either. She looked at him the way a person looks when they have been rehearsing a moment for so long that now that it has finally arrived, they are not sure the rehearsal prepared them for the real weight of it. She said, "My name is Clara." The porch light buzzed. A moth went at it without sense or strategy, as moths do. She said, "I think you're my father." Elias Van looked at the blanket. He looked at the rabbit with the uneven ear. He did not cry, because he was not built for crying at the moment things broke open. He was built for stillness, for the long quiet that follows the thing that cannot be taken back. He stepped aside. He said, "Come in." She came in. And the story that Harlow Ridge had told about Elias Van for 27 years, the simple, clean story of a man who had lost everything in a fire, and made his peace, and gone on living quietly. That story cracked right down the center. Not loudly, not with any drama, the way ice cracks on a river in early spring, a sound that is almost nothing, and then everything moves. Elias Van had spent 27 years being the man the town felt sorry for, not in a cruel way. Harlow Ridge was not a cruel place. People there felt sorry for Elias the way they felt sorry for a tree that had been struck by lightning, with respect, with a kind of reverence for the fact that it was still standing. He had moved to the Ridge in 1993, 3 years before the fire. He had come from a town 2 counties east, where he had grown up in a house with too many people in too small a space, and he had wanted land and quiet. He had found both. He had also found Dina Colley, who was from the Ridge herself, who sold eggs and honey at the Saturday market, and who had the particular quality of making everyone around her feel that they had said something more interesting than they actually had. They married in 1994. Small ceremony. Her family, his, a few friends, a preacher who got slightly lost on the back road and arrived apologizing. Elias had worn a tie that was too tight and did not care at all. They were happy. Not the loud, performing kind of happy. The quiet kind. The kind that does not need an audience. When Dina became pregnant in early 1996, Elias built a second room onto the back of the house. He did it mostly himself, with some help from a neighbor named Pete Garland, who knew more about framing than he did. The room was small but well made. He had put a window in the east wall so the morning light would come in first thing. Clara arrived in October. She was small and loud, and had Dina's dark eyes and Elias's ears, which Dina found endlessly funny. They had 4 months. 4 months of the specific particular madness of new parents. The exhaustion and the tenderness all tangled up together. Neither of them sleeping more than 3 hours at a stretch. Both of them not caring. Because she was here, and she was real, and she was theirs. In February of 1997, there was a fire. Elias had been at Pete Garland's place that evening, helping him repair a fence that the winter had pulled apart. He came home to smoke. He came home to his neighbors in the road, to a fire crew that had driven 40 minutes from the nearest station, to a back section of his house that was gone. The official report said accidental. Faulty wiring in the new room, the room he had built, the room with the east-facing window. The investigator had been thorough in the way that very tired people are thorough, which is to say he had moved quickly through the motions of thoroughness without any actual curiosity driving it. He smelled like cigarettes. He closed his notebook in 20 minutes. He said he was sorry for Elias's loss, and he meant it, in the absent way that people mean things they say at fires and funerals. No remains were recovered. The fire investigator said this was not unusual given the temperature of the burn. He said it with clinical confidence, the way men say things when they want you to stop asking. Elias had buried 2 empty caskets. He had planted 2 dogwood trees where the back wall of the house used to be. He had never rebuilt that room. He had made his peace. That was the phrase people used. He has made his peace. They said it with admiration. Some of them said it as a kind of goal for themselves, a thing to aspire to, as if Elias had accomplished something difficult and rare. What Elias had actually done was simpler and harder than that. He had gotten up every morning. He had fixed things, lawnmowers, washing machines, a widow's furnace, a teenager's bicycle. His hands knew how to hold broken things without flinching. That was the whole of it. He had not dated anyone. He had not left the ridge for more than a few days at a time. He had not renovated the house or added to it, or changed much of anything. He still sat in the cracked wooden chair on the porch on summer evenings, the one he had sat in while learning to embroider. He had told himself he was not waiting. He had almost believed it. Clara sat in his kitchen and put the blanket on the table between them. She kept her hands near it but did not hold it, as if she was aware that it belonged to someone else first. Elias made tea. He did it because he needed to do something with his hands, and because the kettle and the cups and the ordinary business of it gave him something to look at other than her face, which was giving him a feeling he had no name for, and no immediate use for, and which he needed a moment to put somewhere safe. She looked like Dina, not entirely, but enough. Around the jaw and the way her eyes moved when she was thinking, not looking for something, just processing. He set the cup in front of her. She wrapped her hands around it and said, "I didn't know about you. I want you to know that. I didn't know you existed until 8 months ago." Elias sat down across from her. He said, "Tell me," she told him. The woman who had raised Clara was named Janet Colley. She had been a distant cousin of Dina's. She had lived most of her life in a small city in Ohio, where she worked as a bookkeeper for a regional logistics company. She had never married. She had never had children of her own. She was, by Clara's description, a quiet and careful woman who gardened on weekends and kept her home extremely tidy, and who was, in the particular way of very organized people, not always easy to be close to. Clara had grown up not knowing she was adopted. She had grown up knowing Janet as her mother, knowing the Ohio city as her home, knowing the story that Janet had given her, which was that her birth parents had died in an accident when she was an infant. No names, no place, no photographs. When Clara had asked, as children always do. Janet had said, "It is painful for me to speak about," and Clara had loved Janet enough to let it go. She had let it go for 20 years. Janet had been diagnosed in November and was gone by the following June. It went that fast, which was merciful in the biological sense and devastating in every other. She left her house and her savings and a box. The box was in the top of the hall closet, behind winter blankets. Clara found it 3 weeks after the funeral, going through the house the way surviving people go through houses, slowly, with long pauses, picking up objects and not knowing what to do with them. The box had Clara's name on it, in Janet's handwriting. Inside, it was a letter. Clara did not read the letter to Elias that evening. She was not ready for that, and she seemed to know that he was not ready for it either. She told him the shape of what it contained, the way you describe a room without listing everything in it. Janet had been there that night, the night of the fire. She had not been there when the fire started. She had arrived 2 hours before it, in response to a phone call from Dina. Dina had called her and told her she needed her to come, and to bring her car and not to tell anyone, and to come straight to the back of the house. Janet had driven through the night from Ohio. She had taken Clara, a 4-month-old infant wrapped in a yellow blanket, handed through the back window of a house that was not yet on fire. Dina had handed her daughter out the window to her cousin, with the specific calm of a woman who has made a decision so complete and so considered that there is no room left in her for hesitation. She had looked back at the house. Dina had already moved away from the window. Janet had driven away. She had driven through the night back to Ohio with a baby she did not know how to care for, and a blanket with a rabbit on it, and a terror so total it had no bottom, and she had never gone back. She had never contacted Elias. She had never contacted anyone. She had raised Clara as her own. She had kept the blanket. In the letter, she explained why she had stayed silent. She used the word fear more than once. She used the phrase, "She made me promise." She wrote that she had done wrong by staying quiet so long and that she knew it. She wrote that she was sorry in the way people write sorry, when they know the word is not adequate but have no larger word to offer. She wrote one other thing. The thing that had made Dina call her that night. The thing that had made Dina hand her daughter out a window and walk back into a house that would be burning by morning. Janet wrote it in 2 sentences, at the bottom of the 3rd page, as if she had been building toward it the entire letter and had still almost not managed to say it. Elias read those 2 sentences when Clara finally showed him the letter, much later that night. He read them twice. He set the letter down on the table next to the yellow blanket. He looked out the window at the dark yard, where 2 dogwood trees stood, that he could not see in the dark but knew were there. He said nothing for a long time. Then he said, "Who else knows?" Clara said, "Nobody, just us." He nodded once. He said, "Then we need to be careful." The 2 sentences at the bottom of Janet's letter said this. Dina saw the document. She knew what Norman Hale had done, and she knew he knew she had seen it. Norman Hale. Elias had not spoken that name out loud in years, not because he had forgotten it, because it was the kind of name that felt different in the mouth than other names, heavier, with a particular texture, like biting down on something that should not be in your food. He had not spoken it because there had been no reason to. Norman Hale had simply been part of the landscape of Harlow Ridge, the way a particular rock formation is part of a landscape. You see it every day. You stop noticing it. It is simply there. Norman Hale was 64 years old. He had grown up in Harlow Ridge and had never left in any meaningful way. He had gone to the state university, studied business, come back, and attached himself to the economic structure of the ridge, the way vines attach to a wall, slowly, thoroughly, until people stopped noticing where the wall ended, and the vine began. He owned property, several parcels, scattered across 2 counties. He had a stake in a supply company that serviced the mining operations that had been the main industry in the region until they weren't. He sat on the county land board. He attended the Harlow Ridge Community Church, where for 11 years after the fire, Elias Van had also attended and had shaken Norman Hale's hand every Sunday without knowing. He was considered a steady man, a community man, The kind of man who showed up when there was a fundraiser or a road repair or a town meeting about zoning. The kind of man who was mentioned in local news for doing ordinary civic things and was described in those mentions as well-respected. Elias had never liked him, specifically. He had never had a reason not to like him either, specifically. Norman Hale existed in the category of people you know without knowing. People who occupy the background of your life the way furniture occupies a room. That was what Elias had believed. Now Clara sat across from him, and the letter sat on the table, and the two sentences at the bottom of the third page changed the geometry of everything. He needed to understand what Dina had seen. Janet's letter was not precise about this. It was precise about the fact that Dina had seen something, a document of some kind, in the final weeks before the fire. It was precise about the fact that Dina had been frightened by what she saw, frightened enough to call Janet, frightened enough to make the decision she made. But Janet either did not know exactly what the document contained, or she had chosen not to write it down, and Elias suspected it was some of both. What Elias knew about Norman Hale and documents was this. Norman Hale had, in the mid-1990s, been involved in a land transaction that had caused a small amount of local controversy and a large amount of local forgetting. There had been a parcel, roughly 80 acres, in the northeastern section of the county. It had belonged to an elderly man named Walter Ricks, who had no children and whose health had declined sharply in the last 2 years of his life. The parcel had been sold in 1995 to a holding company with a name that sounded like a company, but was constructed the way certain names are constructed, to sound like something without being something. The controversy had been brief. A few people had asked questions. A local reporter had written a short piece. Norman Hale had given a statement to that reporter that was so entirely reasonable and measured and complete that the questions had simply stopped. The reporter had moved on. The land had changed hands. Walter Ricks had died 4 months later in a care facility. Elias remembered this because he remembered most things, in the way people who live quietly and do not crowd their minds with noise tend to remember things. He had filed it away without attaching much importance to it, because at the time he'd had no reason to attach importance to it. Now he was attaching importance to it. Dina had seen a document, something connected to Norman Hale, something she understood well enough to be frightened by it, frightened enough to act. Dina had not been a frightened woman. She had been precise and clear-eyed and not easily rattled. For her to have made the choice she made, the thing she saw had to have been serious. He thought about this for a long time, sitting in his kitchen with Clara, while the tea went cold. There were two possibilities. The first was that the document showed something criminal, something that Norman Hale had done that could be proven if the document existed. The second was that it showed something that could not be proven, but that Norman Hale could not afford to have seen by the right people, which was sometimes worse. Either way, Dina had seen it. And then, 6 weeks later, there was a fire. And an investigator who moved quickly and closed his notebook and retired 6 months later on a pension that did not match his public salary. Elias had accepted the story of the fire because grief does this to people. It makes them need the story to be simple. It makes them take the version they are given because the alternative, the version where the thing that happened was not an accident, requires a person to keep the wound open indefinitely. Elias had not had the capacity for that. He had taken the simple story and held it and built his life around it and called it peace. He understood now that it had not been peace. It had been the particular exhaustion that wears the costume of peace. He looked at Clara. She looked back at him without flinching. She had, he was realizing, a great deal of her mother in her. Not just the jaw and the way her eyes moved. The stillness. The way she could sit in a difficult moment without trying to fill it with words. He said, "Your mother was not a person who scared easy." Clara said, "No." He said, "Whatever she saw was real." Clara said, "Yes." He said, "And Norman Hale is still here. Still in the county." Clara said, "I know. I looked him up before I came." Elias stood up from the table. He walked to the window and looked out at the dark yard. Somewhere past the tree line the ridge dropped away toward the hollow, and the lights of the lower town were just barely visible, pale yellow smears in the dark. He had a daughter, sitting at his kitchen table, alive, 27 years old, with her mother's eyes in a blanket with an uneven-eared rabbit that he had made with his own hands in the summer of 1996. He had a daughter, and her mother had not run from the fire. Her mother had walked back into the house knowing what was coming, because she had understood that if she ran, the thing she knew would follow her and Clara both, and she had decided that was not acceptable. He felt something move through him that was not grief, exactly, and was not anger, exactly. It was something older than both of those things, something that lived below them, the bedrock that everything else sat on. He turned around. He said, "We are going to be very careful. We are going to think before we do anything. And then we are going to find out exactly what she saw." Clara nodded. She reached out and touched the blanket, just briefly, the flat of her hand against the yellow fabric, the way her mother had touched it once. Neither of them said anything. Outside, the two dogwood trees stood in the dark yard, roots deep in the same ground where the back room had been, where the window had faced east, where Clara had come into the world and been wrapped in yellow, and given a rabbit with one ear longer than the other, and for 27 years that ground had held its silence the way good ground holds things. Until tonight, when a knock came at 6 in the evening, and the door opened, and silence became insufficient. Elias had told himself for 27 years that he had made his peace. He understood now that the peace had never been his. It had been borrowed, and the lender had come to collect. The next morning, Elias was up before the sun. He did not sleep much on normal nights. On this night he had not slept at all, and he had not tried to, because trying felt dishonest. He had sat in the wooden chair on the porch until the cold made it impractical, and then moved inside, and sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that he refilled 3 times without tasting. Clara slept in the small bedroom at the front of the house, the one he kept made up with no particular expectation. He had listened to the house settle around her, and felt the specific strangeness of another person's breathing, in a structure that had contained only his own for a very long time. He was not sorry she was here. He was afraid of what being glad she was here would cost him, and he was managing that fear the way he managed most things, by putting it somewhere and attending to what was in front of him. What was in front of him was Norman Hale. Not the man himself, not yet. What was in front of him was the question of what Dina had seen and whether any trace of it still existed. Documents from the 1990s did not simply vanish. They went into boxes in offices, into files in county buildings, into the particular institutional memory of bureaucracies that forget nothing, but organize everything so poorly that finding any specific thing requires either luck or knowledge of the system. Elias knew something about the system, not because he had ever needed it before, but because he had lived in the county his entire adult life, and had watched how things moved, and who sat where, and which names appeared on which applications, and which approvals. Quiet men who fix things see a great deal that other people do not notice. He knew, for instance, that the county land office kept records going back to the 1960s. He knew that deed transfers were public documents, filed and indexed. He knew that the holding company that had purchased Walter Ricks's 80 acres in 1995 had a name, Sycamore Valley Holdings, and that the name was on public record. He also knew something else. He had known it for years without knowing he knew it. It was the kind of knowledge that sits in the back of a person without announcing itself. He knew that the man who had sat on the county land board for the past 11 years, the man who voted on property assessments and transfer approvals and zoning variances, was Norman Hale. And he knew that the man who had served as county clerk from 1993 to 2002, the man who had processed the Ricks land transfer, was a person named Gerald Payne. Gerald Payne had retired. He lived now in a double-wide on the south edge of the county, near a creek, where he kept a small vegetable garden and seemed to be living out his years with the minimum possible complication. Elias had repaired his lawnmower twice. They were not friends. They were the kind of acquaintances who knew each other well enough to be honest, in a way that strangers and friends sometimes cannot be. He needed to talk to Gerald Payne. Not about Norman Hale. Not directly. That would close the door before he got through it. He needed to talk to Gerald Payne about the kind of thing Gerald Payne could talk about without knowing what he was actually saying. Clara came into the kitchen at 7 in the morning. She was dressed. She had not slept either, or not much. And she had the particular clarity that extreme tiredness sometimes produces, a brightness around the eyes that looks almost like alertness and is actually something rawer than that. He poured her coffee. He told her what he was thinking. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she said, "You think the document still exists somewhere?" He said, "I think Dina was not the kind of person to see something once and be satisfied that she understood it. I think she would have found the source." Clara was quiet. Then she said, "Janet's letter said that Dina had been going to the county building." Elias looked at her. She said, "It was in the middle of the second page. I should have pointed it out last night. I was trying to get through it in order. Janet wrote that in the 3 weeks before she called her. Dina had been making trips to the county seat. Janet said Dina told her she was following a thread." Following a thread. That was exactly what Dina would have said. That was her phrase for it. The thing she did when something did not add up, when she found a loose end and could not leave it alone. She had been like that with everything. With books, with stories people told her that did not quite fit together, with the small social inconsistencies of people she cared about. Following a thread. She had been following a thread 6 weeks before the fire. Elias set down his cup. He said, "We need to go to the county building." Clara said, "Today?" He said, "Not together. You shouldn't be seen with me yet. Not until I understand what we're walking into." She looked at him with something he could not entirely read. It might have been relief that he was thinking clearly. It might have been something else, some private recalibration happening inside her, as she understood who he was. This man she had come to find. This father who had existed for her whole life as an absence. He said, "I know this is not how you expected this to go." She said, "I didn't expect anything specific. I just expected it to be real." He nodded. She picked up her coffee and looked out the window at the yard and the 2 dogwood trees, just becoming visible in the early gray light. She said, "She planted those?" He said, "I planted them." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "She would have liked that." He believed that was true. He believed a great many things that morning that he had not believed the day before, and the believing was not comfortable and not simple, and he did not expect it to be either of those things. He drove to the county seat alone, in the truck he had owned for 11 years, and maintained with the same attentiveness he gave to everything mechanical. It was a 40-minute drive on roads he knew so well he barely needed to see them. He was not afraid of what he would find. He was afraid of what he would find, and then not be able to prove. He was afraid of the specific distance between knowing and being able to say it in a way that carries weight. That was the distance Dina had been trying to cross, and that distance had cost everything. He would not be careless with it. The county building opened at 8:30. He arrived at 8:45 and asked a woman at the front desk about deed transfer records from 1995. She was helpful in the way of people who find their work genuinely interesting, which he had not expected and was glad of. She walked him to the records room herself. The records room smelled like paper and time. The files were organized by year and then by parcel number, and then by the name of the property involved at the time of transfer. It took him 40 minutes to find what he was looking for. Sycamore Valley Holdings, parcel 7-1114, transfer date, March 14, 1995, previous owner, Walter A. Ricks. He read through the transfer documents carefully. They were in order. They were entirely in order, which was itself a kind of information. Everything clean. Everything dated correctly. Every signature where it should be. Processed by Gerald Payne, county clerk. He photographed every page with his phone. Then he found the second document. It was not attached to the Ricks transfer. It was in the adjacent folder, the one for the parcel directly north of the Ricks land, parcel 7-1115, which had not changed hands. It had not changed hands officially. But someone had filed, in that folder, an unsigned assessment document from 1996, and that document listed Sycamore Valley Holdings as the current assessed owner of Parcel 7-1115. Parcel 7-1115 had not been transferred. There was no deed of sale. There was no record of purchase. There was only this unsigned assessment, sitting in a folder where it should not have been, describing a ownership that had never been legally recorded. Elias stared at it for a long time. Then he understood. It was not the document itself that was the crime. It was the preparation for a crime. Someone had staged the paperwork. Someone had been moving pieces into position, quietly, incrementally, the way land gets absorbed in places where nobody is watching too carefully. You file an assessment with an incorrect owner. You let it sit. You let it accumulate the quiet weight of documentation, and then at the right moment, a parcel that was never legally sold becomes, in the paper record, a parcel that has been in someone's portfolio for years. Dina had come here. She had been following a thread, and she had found this folder, and she had understood what she was looking at. He photographed that document too. He drove home in the gray morning and said nothing to anyone, and when he came through the door, Clara was at the kitchen table with the blanket folded in her lap, and she looked up at him, and he sat down, and placed his phone on the table, and showed her the photographs, and she looked at them for a long time without speaking. Then she said, "She found this." He said, "Yes." She said, "And he knew she found it." He said, "Yes." Outside, the dogwood trees moved in a light wind, their branches bare in November, patient in the way of trees, which hold their position, regardless of what happens at their roots. He had what Dina had found. He had more than that now, because he had time she had not had, and a clarity that grief had denied him, and a daughter sitting across from him who was alive, and who had her mother's jaw, and her mother's way of sitting still inside the difficult thing. He had one more thing he needed. He needed to know if anyone else had seen what was in that folder. He needed to know if Gerald Payne had known. And he needed to know, before he spoke to anyone with authority, whether the person he was building a case against had the kind of protection that made cases disappear before they could be heard. Norman Hale was 64 years old. He was well respected. He had 11 years on the county land board and connections to people at the state level that Elias only knew about in the way you know about weather that is still over the next mountain. None of that changed what the documents showed. None of that changed what Dina had walked back toward. Elias looked at his daughter. He said, "I need to find someone I can trust to look at these." Clara said, "I know someone." He looked at her. She said, "I'm an accountant. I've spent 5 years working forensic audits. I know what fraudulent paper trails look like, and I know the right people to take them to." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "She would have found that funny." Clara looked at him carefully and said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Dina, that you turned out to be the kind of person who follows threads." Clara looked down at the blanket in her lap. She smoothed the edge of it with her thumb, the faded yellow edge, the embroidered corner with the rabbit. She did not say anything. She did not need to. Some things were already said by the time words arrived for them, said in the way that a window facing east is already a kind of decision, already a kind of declaration, before any particular morning comes through it. 2 weeks passed. Quiet weeks, on the surface. Elias went about his days. He fixed a generator for a man up the road. He stacked wood on the south side of the house for the winter. He drove into town twice, once for groceries, once to drop a repaired washing machine back to a family in the hollow below the ridge. He nodded to people. He said the usual things. He stopped in at the hardware store and talked for 20 minutes about nothing in particular with the owner, who was a man named Dale Finch, and who had known Elias for 20 years and who noticed, in the way that people who have known someone for 20 years notice things, that Elias seemed slightly different, though he could not have said how. He said nothing to Dale Finch about any of it. Clara was not in Harlow Ridge during this time. She had gone back to her city, to her apartment, to the work she needed to continue doing, so that no one would notice any change in her routine. She and Elias spoke by phone in the evenings, briefly, carefully. She had brought the photographs of the documents to a colleague she trusted, a man named Peter Alderton, who worked in financial crime investigation at a federal level, and who owed Clara what she described, simply, as a serious favor. She had told Elias that Peter Alderton was not someone who moved fast, but was someone who moved correctly, and she had learned over 5 years of doing this work that those were not the same thing, and that only one of them mattered. Elias had agreed with this. He agreed with it not because he was patient by nature, exactly, but because he had spent 27 years in a relationship with the consequences of an event that had not been correctly investigated, and he understood in his bones what incorrect investigation produced. It produced a man who sat in a county church for 11 years not knowing whose hand he was shaking. He had, during these 2 weeks, driven past Norman Hale's property twice. Not slowly, not in any way that could be read as surveillance. Both times it was on legitimate errands that happened to take him down that road. Both times he had looked at the long driveway, the white farmhouse set back from the road, the black iron mailbox with the name on it, and had kept driving. He was not ready to confront the man. He was not sure confronting the man was even the right architecture for what needed to happen. Confrontation was satisfying in the way of short and simple things. What was needed here was something that would not give Norman Hale the opportunity to prepare, or deflect, or make phone calls. What was needed was the kind of pressure that comes from evidence assembled in the right order by the right people. Peter Alderton was doing that assembling. What Elias had found was the starting point. The Ricks parcel and the assessment document were the visible edge of something larger. Alderton had found, through channels Elias did not ask about and did not want to ask about, that Sycamore Valley Holdings was not a unique event. It was a method. The same structure had been used in 4 other counties over a 12-year period. Different parcel numbers, different original owners. The same invisible hand in each transaction. The same signature style on certain documents. A way of forming the letter H at the beginning of a name that showed up in paperwork across all 4 counties. It was not proof, not yet, but it was the kind of detail that, combined with other details, constructed a pattern that was not accidental. Gerald Payne had been contacted. This had not been Elias's doing. This had been Alderton's, through official channels that Elias was not part of. Elias knew about it because Clara told him, on a Thursday evening phone call, that Gerald Payne had agreed to a voluntary interview, and that the interview had lasted 3 hours, and that afterward Gerald Payne had looked, according to the federal investigator who sat across from him, like a man who had been holding something very heavy for a very long time, and had finally been permitted to put it down. Elias did not know exactly what Gerald Payne had said. He suspected. He thought about it on the porch in the evenings, in the cold November air, sitting in the cracked wooden chair. He thought about Dina. He thought about her in a way he had not allowed himself to think about her for years, not with the soft distance of grief, but directly, specifically, the way she moved, the sound of her laugh, which was not polite or contained, but full, and slightly too loud for any room. The way she had looked at him in the early morning, before either of them had spoken, when the light was coming in the east-facing window of the back room. He thought about the decision she had made. He had been thinking about it since Clara arrived, turning it over the way a person turns over a stone to see what lives beneath it. He had not been angry at her, which surprised him. He had expected to feel anger at some point, the particular anger of someone who was left out of a choice that changed their entire life. But when he reached for that anger, it wasn't there. What was there instead was something he could only describe as recognition. He recognized the decision. It was the decision of a person who knew the exact shape of the danger and made the calculation that the danger could be contained, minimized, redirected, if the most important thing was moved out of its path. She had moved Clara out of its path. She had been wrong that she could contain it, but she had been right about which thing was most important. He did not need to forgive her for that. Forgiveness implied a wrong that needed correcting, and he was not sure wrong was the right word for a decision made in genuine terror with no good options and the best possible materials. She had been right about the blanket too. Don't redo it. That's the one. On the 15th day after Clara's first visit, she came back. She drove up in a car he didn't recognize and parked in the road and came up the path and knocked. 3 solid hits, the same knock as before. He was already at the door. She came in. She put her bag down. She looked at him and said, "Alderton is ready to move." He said, "How ready?" She said, "Grand jury ready." He was quiet. She said, "There are 2 other witnesses besides Gerald Payne, former employees of the holding company who have been waiting, apparently, for someone to ask." He said, "They knew." She said, "They knew enough." He sat down at the kitchen table. She sat across from him. The blanket was on the side table in the living room now, where he had placed it after Clara's first visit. Not out of sight, not folded away, just placed somewhere it could be present, without being the center of everything. He said, "What happens to him?" Clara said, "That depends on how the process goes. But Alderton says the paper trail is thorough. He says." She paused, and he could see her choosing words, not to protect him but because she wanted to be precise. He says the investigator who closed the fire case in 1997, but there are records. There's a retirement package that had no legitimate source. Alderton says it's not provable the way a direct transaction would be, but it's enough to raise the original investigation as an open question. Elias said, "An open question." Clara said, "They'll reclassify the fire." He said nothing. She said, "I know that doesn't fix what it was." He said, "No." She said, "But it means it's on record. It means it's named correctly." He thought about this. He thought about the specific value of something being named correctly, even when naming it could not reverse what it had done. He thought about the 2 empty caskets and the phrase he had made his peace, and all the Sunday mornings and the shaken hand. He said, "She deserves that." Clara said, "Yes." There was a long silence between them. Not uncomfortable. The kind of silence that occurs between people who are beginning to understand the weight of the thing they are carrying together and are taking a moment to distribute it properly. He said, "After this is done, when it goes wherever it goes, what do you do?" She said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Do you go back to Ohio?" She looked at him for a moment. She looked at the table and then at the window and then back at him. She said, "I haven't decided." He said, "The front bedroom gets morning light." He did not say anything else. He stood up and went to the stove to reheat the coffee, and she looked at his back and then at the window and did not say anything either, because there was nothing to add to that, because some things are said in the smallest possible units and cannot be made larger without losing the essential quality that makes them matter. She had his ears. He had noticed this finally, 3 days after her first visit, looking at a photograph she had sent him of herself at some office event, years ago, standing at the edge of a group of people, slightly apart in the way of people who are more comfortable observing than being observed. His ears. Dina had found that endlessly funny. Once, 27 years ago, in a different life that turned out to be the same life after all, just interrupted, just disassembled and waiting to be put back together by the right hands. He had good hands for that. He poured the coffee. Outside, the dogwood trees stood in the November yard, bare and patient and still, their roots in the same ground where the back room had been, where the window had faced east, where a 4-month-old had been wrapped in yellow and handed out into a night that had seemed, for a long time, like an ending. It had not been an ending. It had been the longest pause he had ever lived through. And now, at 58 years old, with coffee on the stove and his daughter in his kitchen, and 2 sentences on the bottom of a letter that had finally named the thing correctly, Elias Van was at the end of the pause. He set the cup in front of her. She wrapped her hands around it. Norman Hale did not yet know that the thread Dina had started pulling 27 years ago had never stopped moving. He did not yet know that it had traveled through a letter in a box in a closet, through a blanket with an uneven-eared rabbit, through a drive across 3 states on a November evening, through 40 minutes in a county records room, and a forensic accountant, and a man named Peter Alderton who moved correctly, and a former clerk named Gerald Payne who had been holding something heavy for a very long time. He did not yet know that the thread had arrived, intact and taut and unbroken, at a kitchen table in Harlow Ridge, West Virginia, in the hands of the two people who had the most reason in the world to pull it. But he would. Soon. And the pulling would be done correctly. Because that was what Dina had deserved in 1997, and she had not gotten it. And that was what she was going to get now, 27 years late, through the hands of a man who had learned how to hold broken things, and a daughter who knew how to follow a thread, sitting together in a kitchen, where the coffee was warm, and the morning was coming, and outside in the bare November yard, 2 dogwood trees held their ground, the way things hold their ground when the roots go deep enough, and the ground itself remembers what was planted there. The door did not need to be knocked on again. It was already open,